and I will say welcome to PLC IV. This is our last face-to-face session for the semester, and so we're going to do a little bit of stuff with project-based learning. PBL stuff is what we did right before all this madness kind of took place. So you watched some videos on that before. I'm gonna direct you to watch. I'm gonna give you time during during the time we have together to watch one video that I don't think we've seen. Kind of have a conversation wrapped around both project-based learning and also just a wrap up of some of the other stuff that we've talked about over this last block with equitable grading. And I'm gonna get your thoughts in smaller groups about whether or not you plan to implement some of the stuff that we've talked about to potentially ensure equitable grading in the framework of your class. And then there's a last wrap-up activity that you'll do as an individual that kind of asks you to put a number on, you know, if you're looking at do-overs in your class on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to implement a do-over policy in your class, something along those lines. So that's kind of what we're going to take a look at today. And let me share my screen with you. Everything that you need for today is found in the module that's called Equitable Grading. We're going to do a little bit with this page called Project-Based Learning, and then this wrap-up discussion is what you're going to look at also. So let me show you the project-based learning videos first. I think there's 4 videos in here. I know that we watched a couple of these earlier in our actual legit face-to-face sessions. So the one I'm going to ask you to watch in particular is this one. It's called 5 Keys to Rigorous Project-Based Learning, and it just kind of gives you a background about PBL and what you need to put it in place and some of the advantages that it can give you. The best of these videos is one that we've already, this is my opinion, the best of these videos is one that we've already watched, but I would encourage you to go back and watch this again. Project-based learning in action. It's about closing the achievement gap. I know that we're middle school, high school folks here in this class, and this is an elementary class, but the themes that they talk about in terms of achievement and closing that achievement gap, they're ubiquitous. I mean, they're K-12 in nature. But because we've watched that video, I'm not gonna have you watch it today. So so I'm gonna have you do that here in just a moment. And then, okay, so my internet wasn't working there for a second. And then I'm going to have you in smaller groups also kind of talk about this as far as a wrap-up discussion. And then individually, I want you to kind of respond to this. It says, on a scale from 1 to 10, rate your intent to implement the following equitable grading practices in your future classroom. Give a short, and heavy on the short, explanation to explain each number that you chose. So accepting late work for full credit. On a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to implement something like that in your classroom? Not just accepting late work. There'll probably be a school policy in place, you know, but how is it that you plan to accept late work? Would you do it for full credit? On a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to do that? Allowing do-overs on assignments and tests. Is that something that you might be likely to do? Recording nothing lower than a 50% in your gradebook. So for example, if a student scores 22 out of 100 on a test, it still goes in the gradebook as 50 out of 100. How likely are you to possibly do something like that? Rick Wormelli is very, very adamant. We've watched some stuff on Wormelli earlier this semester, very adamant that the cutoff should be 50 and that you shouldn't go any lower than 50. And I actually tend to believe that too. I mean, if you've got a 10% window for A, B, C, D, and A, B, C, and D, why would you not just have a 10% window for F too? So something like that makes sense to me. But how likely are you to implement that? And then we've talked about standards-based grades. My sense is that there'll be a lot of lower numbers on that one, and that's fine. But then also project-based learning. How likely might you be to implement something along those lines in your classroom? So what I found as far as watching videos on Zoom is that you can see the video, but you can't hear it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording here for just a moment. Actually, stop the share first. I'm going to resume recording. Welcome back. Thanks for doing that. I appreciate you watching those videos. Now we'll kind of do the screen share again. And in the equitable grading module, there's this wrap-up discussion. And so I'll put you back into not individual groups anymore, but like smaller groups, and just kind of have some basic conversations about these things. It doesn't necessarily have to be anything too in-depth. but on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you be at? It's good to think about you as a teacher in your own classroom, because it's coming up fairly soon. It may not seem like it. It may seem like it's a long way off, but within the next couple of years, you guys will be in your classrooms and you will be expected to have stuff set up policy-wise for all of these things. And so it's worth talking about where you fall on the scale. Now, some of these things, like accepting late work, either for full credit or for not, some of that is put into actual school policy too. So you pretty much have to do what the school tells you. But if your school policy is open-ended, maybe you would consider doing late work for full credit. What is your policy on do-over? Some schools have a no-zero policy, which is kind of a double-edged sword sometimes. But what would your policy be for do-overs and how that sort of thing? Would you be likely to implement it? This is maybe the most controversial thing that's on this list, and it probably shouldn't be. But if a student gets less than a 50%, how likely would you be to just record it as a 50% in your grade book? And why would we even do that? I mean, if we're talking about equitable grading, I mean, that's why I bring this up. But why should one bad day affect how a kid performs for the rest of the semester? That would be my reasoning for not putting anything lower than a 50. But you do you, and you figure that out. And then standards-based grades, which based on our conversation from last week, and I think I said this earlier, my feeling is that the numbers on this will be pretty low, quite honestly, and that's fine. But what about project-based learning? You've watched this video on it, and we've watched some videos earlier, and I'm sure you've probably heard about it in the framework of some of the other classes. And now that my understanding is that in the integrated curriculum class, you've designed a unit and you've dealt with multiple standards and all that sort of thing. Maybe this is something that kind of falls into your lap. Maybe this is something that that you might see the value of. And so I'd be interested to see what your numbers were for that as well. So again, I'm going to pause the video here and I'll put you into small groups, not individual groups, but small groups.
I think we just finished.
Just finished. Okay,
number
wow.
3. Oh.
That's good. So what are your thoughts? What are you thinking about on the scales of 1 to 10? That seems to be, for whatever reason, this particular class has gravitated toward those kind of scales, I think. What about the late work for full credit? That's the one that's a good starter, because everybody's like, oh yeah, I'll accept late work. But would you accept it for full credit? What did your groups decide on that?
Oh, go ahead. Were you saying something, Liz?
No, you're good.
Okay. Our group was kind of questioning what we would do, because the people in our group are either band or art.
Oh yeah.
And so they're not like a lot of turning in papers and kind of assignments, which made our discussion on project-based learning very interesting, as well as just kind of work and accepting assignments, because I don't know, we were just kind of questioning a lot of that stuff, so wondering like how we're going to actually implement it when we're in the classroom versus how likely we're
so so let me throw this out there, like so art, I mean there are certain things that you have to do as far as projects and things along the way that you might choose to accept or not accept for full credit. Music, what would the equivalent of that be? Would you so when I
you either have it or you don't is kind of what it seemed like the conclusion was.
Okay, so let me throw this out there then, just as a maybe not even
Also,
an all
Ashley,
relative hypothetical, but like, so when I took my music classes in high school, we took the basic band and chorus stuff, but then there were also stuff that you go a little more in depth on. There were music theory classes and things where you were actually expected to find time during the school day. They'd carve time out for you to come in and do your practicing of things during the school day. You like have a pass and come out of the school or the class you were in. What if your students weren't able to do that? Would you still be able to find ways to make up the credit for them, and would you accept that as full credit? That might be an equivalent of that. I don't know. In that way, practice time might be practice time, but the point of practice time for that was that it would be with the actual music teachers. So I'm not sure. Yeah. Some things
I actually
translate.
had something that I don't want to take, but it was kind of a consideration. of what happens at the Maryville schools for the, uh, you're talking about at the Maryville schools where they have like their weekly or every other week thing.
Um,
I don't want to, yeah, anyways.
yeah. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the equivalent for that would be. And the other thing would be that's a nice thought question, but sometimes I think I said this before you went to your small group. Sometimes your school has stuff that's set policy-wise anyway, and it becomes really difficult for you to deviate from that. So I don't know. As I got further along in my career, I did accept late work, and I accepted it for full credit. And sometimes that was not always exactly what the school policy said, but I tried as much as possible to have conversations with my administrators around that and give them the reasons why I wanted to do that. So we'll see. But yeah, that's an interesting thought experiment, and it doesn't necessarily translate as well to some subject matters as others. So you mentioned you guys had a conversation about project-based learning. In some ways, I don't know, in some ways, like music folks, you wouldn't think of what you do as project-based, but in some ways, essentially putting together the music and putting together the actual performance, you know, it's maybe not project-based learning, but it's all performance-based in that way. And everything that you do is also formatively based as well, as far as your classes, all that sort of thing. So those who aren't music folks necessarily, do you have thoughts about the PBL and how you might implement that, or whether you would?
So, Grace and I are math. So we talked about how it could definitely be really helpful in some instances, kind of like giving them more of a real world application side to the math.
Mm-hmm.
And then they can like apply it and they see how it's working in different ways. But we also talked about how, because of like the nature of some of the math, there might be concepts that they're talking about that they don't even have a lot of like prior knowledge to connect to it.
Yeah.
So there are some instances where you can't kind of like, I'm thinking like if you have like no idea, like if you just say like square root, like if they've never heard of that, they're not going to be able to make that connection without some type of direct instruction where you're able to tell them that. But I definitely think that like the project-based learning helps supplement that, and there's definitely ways in which you can apply it. But I don't think, we talked about how we couldn't use it. We don't think it would be like every day and all the time.
Yeah. So are you saying that maybe it's more than a one-size-fits-all thing for what's going to happen in your classroom? That's what I hear you saying?
Yeah.
All right. I feel like we can do that. Yeah. And so that actually might be the good wrap-up for what we've talked about over the last several weeks. Is what I've tried to do is present some options to you about how to level the playing field for certain students in your class, with the understanding that it's not, I mean, you can talk philosophy and you can have, you know, your perfect setting for philosophy all you want, but the real world that you inhabit as an educator is probably not always going to make room for the philosophies that you have as you walk into your classroom. And so that's why so much of teaching is an art, and you can talk about research-based strategies, and you can talk about project-based learning and talk about accepting late work or not accepting late work. But, you know, sometimes the stuff that actually happens in the room itself is going to dictate how you're going to go with that. And so I guess as a final thought on all of this, it would be malpractice for you as an educator to walk into a classroom without a plan of what you're going to do. But by the same token, it would also be malpractice for you as an educator to stick 100% to that plan, no matter what happened, no matter what situations that you faced. The idea of reflection and adjustment and moving forward, even in the midst of all the other stuff that's kind of gone on, is a hallmark of what makes a good educator. But to have some of these things in your back pocket and to have them so that you can either A, fall back on them or plan for them and then adjust after the planning has gone through, I think it's pretty important to have those conversations and talk about them. So that's one of the reasons that that we did it this way. And I think that's a good way to kind of wrap it up. It's definitely it's food for thought. Is it going to happen 100% in every classroom? Absolutely not. But it's food for thought. So I'll go ahead and stop the recording there, and